Disclaimer, this video is largely built upon theory, and some of it could be rendered untrue as we experience more of the story, but it's a very striking idea with where we're at now. Please enjoy the video. From pretty much the very beginning, One Piece is laser-focused on the concept of cycles. Political cycles, cultural cycles, cycles of systematic power. Something that Oda nails into the reader is that there will always be rises and there will always be falls, and that the eras that history is composed of are defined by said rises and falls. And this is an inevitability, that the one thing that you can always count on in the world is that things will always be changing. A king will never hold a crown forever, piracy will not reign supreme for all of time, and anyone on top will either die to kickstart a new era or live long enough to experience a fall. This is one of the main themes of One Piece, and it's not something that should be shied away from, but instead embraced as an ever-present element of the world that represents possibility. Best exemplified through the way that Shanks acts as a personified bridge between eras for Luffy to take the stage. And likewise, this is a message that Rock's D. Xebec, exploding into the narrative like a hurricane, champions in one of his first lines. That no authority in the world lasts forever. As we'll discuss, Rock's is many things, but foremost among them is that he is clear-sighted. Initially, he desires to be king and views the current moment as the prologue of his life, but he has no illusions of needing to maintain power forever. He knows that isn't possible, but he just wants to touch the heavens for as long as he can, and he just wants life to be great while he's alive. And this is in stark contrast to the personified antithesis of the series, Emu, who fights tooth and nail to submerge the world and depresses all to an incredibly unnatural degree in order to hold on to their power as much as possible. Controlled by fear, Emu needs stagnancy and for things to stay the same so they don't have to confront losing their grip on the world. But they will lose. It's simply how the world works, and Luffy is simply inevitable. And so while Emu may have outlived Rock's, and while Rock's was broadly forgotten by history and died in the horrific way they imposed upon him, a way that may have inspired through contrast Kaido's fixation on needing to die a beautiful death to cement a legacy, the amount of time each spent in the world was not nearly as important as the sentiment of the legacy they left behind. And while a lot is made of how Rock's left no tangible legacy, that actually isn't quite true if you look at things from a certain lens. But Emu? All they've become is a pathetic, quivering, fear-addled coward, childlike and weak in spirit and erasing all that terrifies them. As Rock states, Emu is dominated by fear. And I think, in a way, Rock's will have the last laugh due in large part to that supposed non-existent legacy. But more on that soon. In addition to this, I think it can very much be argued that Rock's is One Piece's most honest, definitive version of the pirate. As in, if you had to choose one character to best represent what piracy means, it'd likely be Rock's. He is very admirable and Luffy-like in some ways. His yearning for freedom, his desire for the great expanse, his courage, conviction, energy, and thirst for life. But he is also shown to be unashamedly cruel at times. Pillaging, causing dark chaos and utter destruction in a way that far transcends what Luffy or even Roger are capable of, his crew resembling the Straw Hats in some ways but opposing them in others, lacking in warmth as he took crew members by force through the Davy Back method. And in that way, he is the best descriptor of piracy in a character that there is in the story, the good and the bad. And lamentably, as a result, he was completely erased from history, with very few knowing of his existence and creed. However, there is far more to Rock's than how he contrasts Emu and how he is arguably the most honest personification of piracy, and the lasting resonance of his spirit is actually found elsewhere. Although the way it manifests is incredibly twisted, dark, and upsetting if I'm reading the subtext correctly. As we've learned, Rock's was not only a huge supporter of Davy D. Jones, but an actual direct descendant, with his real name being Davy D. Xebec. And while the story could be pouring cold water on the theory that Davy Jones and Joy Boy are the same person, regardless, Rock's seems to be a spiritual successor of Joy Boy nonetheless. He seems to take on a lot of the traits of Joy Boy, as far as history seems to indicate. The open-armed embrace of freedom and chaos, the championing of dreams, the wide-eyed wonder at the grand expanse of the world. all traits that antithesize Emu and cause them to fear Joy Boy as a result, as well as characterizing their vitriolic distaste for Davy. But narratively, Rox's son and successor is just as important as his ancestor here. Blackbeard, Marshall D. Teach, seems to idolize Rox and is incredibly focused on embodying his legacy. He constantly touts about liberation and dreams. He named his ship, the Saber of Xebec, after his late father. He's reclaimed Rox's old territory on Hachinosu, and just as Rox desired to be king of the world, so too does Blackbeard. Like so many throughout the series, Blackbeard seems to have inherited his father's will, potentially from the declaration of war against Emu to the desire to sit on the world's throne. But there is a dark, skewed tinge to this specific brand of inherited will. It's been speculated in flashbacks that Blackbeard, despite storming into the story with a proclamation championing the eternality of dreams, is actually unable to sleep. Now, this isn't a confirmed fact, but I think it can be viewed as likely, and as such, it would mean that Blackbeard is one of the biggest advocates of dreams in the setting despite not actually being able to dream. If we look at Blackbeard, we see a diametric contrast and bastardization of his foils in every way. He and Luffy are kindred spirits in their pursuit and advocation of dreams and freedom, but Blackbeard actively seeks to destroy, while Luffy liberates. Blackbeard is the darkest night, while Luffy is the sun. Luffy doesn't care about whether the One Piece is real or not because it pales in comparison to the connections and adventures along the way to it, while Blackbeard cannot conceptualize it not being real, otherwise his journey will be worthless in his eyes. Blackbeard takes Whitebeard's devil fruit and uses it for means diametrically opposing what the latter stood for, and while Rox was full of courage, Blackbeard cowers. While Rox charged forth with reckless abandon, Blackbeard is deceptively tactical and strategic, playing it safe surprisingly often, which is sadly something that may have come about from the sheer fear that he was struck with at God Valley. Rox despises and vehemently opposes the world government in every situation, whereas Blackbeard has no qualms about cooperation with them if it helps him achieve his ultimate ends. And most importantly, Rox in the end valued family above all, and Blackbeard sees nothing but a potentially burdening dream. It's stated that Davy D. Jones was once king of the world, and that dream and will were inherited by Rox in a genuine way. But Rox ultimately decided that wasn't his #1 motive and goal, that his family was instead, and Blackbeard may not realize that about his father yet, at least not from his perspective. Blackbeard is a bastardization of nearly every positive trait in those he has dynamics with, and particularly when it comes to the man he seeks to emulate, the differences are stark. So it poses a question. Considering these elements of misinterpretation, misrepresentation, and underlying anxiety, does Blackbeard actually want this dream of taking over the world that he's inherited? Does he feel like he even has a choice in the matter, or is it all that he knows? We know he experienced unimaginable trauma on God Valley before and after being saved by Rox. He's seen mass bloodshed, he's feared for his life, and witnessed his father turn into a monster and attack him. So is that the reason that he cannot sleep, and is the result that he loves the idea of dreams that his father championed, but cannot actually experience them himself? Does he want to defeat Emu to take revenge for his father and carry out his goals as a duty? Is his current goal of becoming king of the world one that was a dream hoisted upon him by the memory and legacy of the late father that he so admires and worships, and was it one that he took on without ever actually thinking of what he himself wants? It is very possible that Blackbeard inherited this will, but unlike the examples of this in the series in which those who inherit said will carry it out because it's truly something they want and because they pour their own individuality into that dream as well, is Blackbeard simply going through the motions while yearning for the end goal alone? Is that why he needs the One Piece to be real? Why he carries out ideals but perhaps doesn't embody them? This would be one of the biggest contrasts with both Rox and Luffy, a need for the results without seeing the value in adventure. Has Marshall D. Teach been poisoned by his perception of his father's wishes, and has he doomed himself to carry out his perceived legacy without living for himself? Rox was aspirational, conquering, cruel, and sadistic, leaving destruction in his wake. But he was possessed by a raucous charisma, led by personal ambitions and desires to a fault. He lived loud, desired a crown, and felt no need to think about living forever as long as he made it worth it. He was reminiscent of those such as Roger and Odin, but was characterized by a darkness that neither possessed. And in opposition to Luffy's warm connections, his crew was obtained pragmatically, although that never meant that there wasn't a camaraderie there. He was unable to properly see eye to eye with Harold and treated Loki with cruelty despite the latter heavily admiring him years later. And above all, he was a worshipper of his direct ancestor Davy Jones, showing the true double-edged sword of chaos and freedom as epitomized by the symbol. But what's key here is a musing that Whitebeard had, that despite his immense conviction and focus on his goals, Rox would often get distracted and lose sight of his tasks. He was an advocate of detours, things that come up and end up meaning more than one's end goal. And the most important detour of all, one that ended up becoming his main goal in and of itself, was family. When things heated up and God Valley became a powder keg, at the end of it all, after becoming a father, Rox realized that his conquest, his freedom, his dream, his throne, none of it mattered as long as his family was safe. And after ensuring their safety by delivering them from hell itself before Eris continued forth, everything else was a bonus and he was able to take on Emu with his comrades with reckless abandon. And then, well, Rox doesn't fear much, but I think that what he would have feared most in his heart of hearts was losing his family and becoming a tool for the entity that he despised, the world government. And Emu made sure both happened when they used Domi Reversi on him to attack those that he loved before begging Garp and Roger to end it. He came to the same conclusion that Luffy did when realizing in the pits of despair that his family was everything. Meanwhile, Blackbeard was fractured from a young age, and I don't believe that this illustration of him crying, unable to sleep as a child, pictured next to a crescent moon resembling Garling, is coincidental. He is haunted and broken. And so through this event and his subsequent potential championing of his father, Blackbeard seems to be a bastardization in human form, warped by trauma. He touts dreams yet cannot sleep. He seeks freedom yet steals it from others. He inherits the fruit of Whitebeard and uses it for wicked ends, with Whitebeard's proclamation that Blackbeard is not him now seeming to hint at his late father in addition to the idea of him being the spearhead of the current era that Roger kickstarted. He does nothing but cause trouble within Whitebeard's crew, whereas Whitebeard backed his father up in a mortal battle to the death before disaster struck. Blackbeard embraces his father's legacy, but it could very easily be a dream that possessed him that he does not identify with, and as it stands, he feels more like an antithesis to it than anything else. And yet, as we've established, there is much that he has in common with Luffy, and that means something. Those who are diametrically opposite to one another are not as such because they have nothing in common. They are as such because they have commonalities and have diverged. I think that in many ways, if he had a bit more luck, perhaps if he was heaven-sent as Luffy was and blessed with a lack of trauma, Blackbeard could have turned out much different. Instead, despite having spiritual, sentimental ties to Joy Boy, he has become another false Joy Boy, just as Kaido was. Not just Luffy's inverse, but a warp of inherited will, an antithesis of the story. Yet, I still believe it's possible for Luffy to help Blackbeard believe, find himself properly, and turn things around. I think he's there to be saved, as Kaido was, in a sense. I think that through properly communicating, through combat or words, with someone who is so like him yet so unalike, Blackbeard would see how his life has been a hollow shell, how Rox would not have wanted this thrust upon him. Rox initially considered himself to be the protagonist of this pocket of history and staked everything on his quest, but ultimately felt the force of something indescribable, otherworldly, and strange. The feeling of fate pulling on the events of the world like a great chain in a way that would mean that he would not get his crown. But he was okay with that, and in a moment of clarity, he realized that nothing mattered to him as long as his wife and son made it out okay. And he doubly ensured that through imploring Garp and Roger to kill him and allow him to die before completely becoming something other than Davy D. Xebec, than Rox, as he fought tooth and nail within himself to keep his mind and humanity. And this sentiment of family was constantly enforced by Whitebeard in life, likely influenced by Rox. As Moneymar from my Twitch chat discusses, the genius of Blackbeard and Whitebeard's dynamic is that they both represent aspects of Rock's dream and beliefs they took from witnessing Rox. Blackbeard is the bastardization of Rox's dream and became the stereotype that has been placed on the Davy, while Whitebeard represents the true dream and wishes of Rox at heart. It makes it all tragic that Blackbeard eventually offed Whitebeard, symbolically killing Rox's true dream in a way. It's a great point, and I do wonder if that dream can be resurrected. We'll talk about that in a second. And on a related note, given what we see from the Rox pirates in the flashback, I think it's clear that Rox made an impact on them, and that they carried that impact forward. Specifically Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard, with the latter two having been struck by Rox's example enough to desire to back their captain up in a battle against the world itself, with all of them being incredibly impacted by his gutting end. Simply put, Blackbeard needs to learn that Rox's final desires weren't actually conquest or kingship or ultimate victory, and that his sentiments and memory have indeed been passed onto those who matter. And he owes him the honor of representing him faithfully, not in this misrepresentative way. In the end, all he cared about was his family, and he fought through unimaginable hurdles for them, for his wife, for his son. And so Blackbeard's conquest is ultimately based on a desire that Rox did not possess towards the end. Will somehow learning this and understanding Luffy cause him to let go? Or maybe it would finally allow him to be able to go all out. The complexion of his task changed from dark to free, from anxiety to earnest desire to be king of the pirates as Marshall D. Teach, rather than the forced soul of Rox. That's as much of an embodiment of Joy Boy's legacy as anything else, and I think that's what his father would have wanted for him. I think this could very well happen, and I think Luffy, the true embodiment of Joy Boy, will be essential for this. Also, Blackbeard has a crew who believe in him and his endeavors, which is something that Rox never really believed that he had in life until the end. It's really not too late. Maybe Blackbeard can learn to live for himself and live well as Rox wished. And perhaps he can carry out his father's legacy in a different way that doesn't undercut his identity. Because there is huge significance in the fact that Rox was one of the sacred few who has witnessed and fought Emu in the flesh. And he said to them that while he may not defeat them in the present, he will return. Perhaps he will return in spirit through his blood, the blood that pumps through Blackbeard. Could it be that in accepting who he is, accepting what he wants, and embodying that honestly, Blackbeard will then give his all to rid the world of the oppressive force of Emu as himself rather than his father? He is an arbiter of freedom after all, and Emu's direct opposition in that way. Emu said that Joy Boy and Davy Jones will never resurface as long as Rox faded into oblivion, and they tried to bury him, but they weren't quite successful. He has a true legacy that will accumulate, leading to Emu's downfall. And that sentiment is the dream that Davy represented, that Rox would have loved to pass on, that Luffy embodies. To not allow this oppressor to control the world. That, in sentiment, is both Davy and Rox's dream. And people's dreams don't ever end. Rox has very few living connections, but Blackbeard is one, and we can't forget Loki, and they carry his legacy, and could result in the defeat of the entity that he so opposed. They are both stated to have been in pursuit of toppling the world, but Emu being described as the world itself in 1162 makes those statements much more than desires to overtake the literal world. It shows the two as Rox's greatest chance of toppling Emu through his legacy. Because as he said, the world does not belong to anyone, let alone someone like Emu. However, despite all of this and how fantastic I think this sounds, it is worth reminding that this is just a theory. I don't think that this is something that is destined to happen. It's just a direction that I could see the story going in that Oda may be hinting at that I find incredibly powerful. And I think it's very much strengthened by the fact that Blackbeard would be dead now if not for Kuma, the personification of the hope and beauty of Nika, saving him on God Valley. Narratively, I just don't see this being anything but a karmic indication that Blackbeard has hope in store for him in some way, shape, or form. Could he and his mother have been potentially separated by Kuma's power due to him having just gotten it and not being able to control it, with Blackbeard assuming that she died? And could reuniting with her and learning about who his father was and who he himself should be a big part of that ascent in addition to Luffy? But there are other, equally powerful directions that the story could go in as well, where Blackbeard potentially fully embraces this dream, where the idea of it not being his own dream doesn't actually come to fruition in the story, and where he comes into his own as an individualistic force of nature and darkness to be taken down with an internal promise to his father similar to the one that Luffy feels to Shanks. Maybe Blackbeard carries forward the dream not out of warmth and love for Rocks, but out of a desire to right his wrongs and do what he couldn't. Although, I find these to be less likely due to his fixation on dreams and how Rocks factors into that. But who knows? Anything can happen, and there is still so much story to come and so much context to be revealed. This video is just one possibility, but it's one so powerful that I felt I had to speak about it. In just one flashback, Rocks has become one of the very best characters in One Piece. And due to the associated revelations, my stocks for Blackbeard have never been higher. I buy into him so much, I find him incredible through the latest developments, and I can easily see him becoming one of my favorite shonen antagonists of all time and one of One Piece's best by the story's end. There's an emotionality and sentiment added to him and the dream hoisted onto him, this bastardization and inverse of inherited will, and the way he diametrically contrasts Luffy while holding similar ideals moves me so much. I think he may be saved in some way by the end, but either way, and regardless of whether or not the ideas I've stated in this video are correct, I'm so confident that he'll end up a masterful character because of the way that Oda is building up so many of these indirect thematics and ideas surrounding him. In the end, there will be a liberation, and Luffy will reign as King of the Pirates. This has been clear from the start. But what of Blackbeard? Will he live or die? Will he confront Emu? Will he be saved and turn things around from being a husk of an ideologue, and will he finally be able to sleep and take in the beauty of dreams? The man who was erased from history, whose blood pumps in his veins, would like nothing more than for this to be the case, but only time will tell. Many thanks for watching.